Your life, as it has been, is over. Resistance is futile.
Greetings, fellow humans and any friendly aliens who may have somehow intercepted this broadcast. Maybe you're smart enough to get into our network, whatever. Well, my name is MrLiveOcean, and I welcome you all to my channel. I try to be somewhat inclusive, but not that inclusive. Recording from an underground bunker at the edge of West Texas, safe from any possible aerial phenomena or tornadoes. Like always, please don't forget to hit the like button. And it would be out of this world if you'd go as far as to double click the subscribe button, or whatever your version of the browser has you click on. As I'm sure most of you are aware, every little interaction helps with the algorithm and my ability to bring you more content in the future. Personally, I like to record longer videos, but my co-creator, who does the editing, insists on keeping it relatively short for the time being. Speaking of aliens from out of this world, or underground, or some other dimension, did you hear the news? Disclosure has happened. Well, that's how Giorgio Tsoukalos, a famous big-haired fella, had explained it in his tweet, or is that an X now? It was from about a week ago, and while not full disclosure, it is a step in that direction. Now, his tweet, or X, is referring to testimony given by David Grush, a United States Air Force officer and former intelligence officer, to the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability, which on face value doesn't sound like something you'd find much in DC anymore, but whatever, it exists. And it's important to note that David had worked with the UAP task force that was in charge of collecting data, and despite his supposedly top secret security clearance, he had no access to the materials and subjects he describes. He claims to have had conversations with individuals who informed him that the U.S. government maintains a highly secretive UFO, or UAP as they now say it, for unidentified aerial phenomena, recovery program, and is in possession of non-human, and some including, quote, dead pilots, end quote. It's also worth noting that these same individuals are concerned that American citizens have been killed as part of the government's efforts to cover up the information. In addition to his testimony, given under oath are the testimonies of U.S. fighter pilots Ryan Graves and David Fravor on their encounters with UAPs. The importance of these testimonies comes from the fact that these statements and videos are now a part of the official record, forever to be enshrined, or however long the U.S. exists for, like some place like the Library of Congress. Giorgio mentions this, but when I first read his tweet, or X, I had the feeling that maybe he doesn't watch the shows he has appeared in. Now, I'm sure that's because he writes more for the people less familiar with the subject who may stumble upon a social media account. I've always thought that the majority of U.S. citizens were aware of this, but then again, many young people can't answer the simple question, when did America declare its independence?
And she is an elementary school teacher.
What year did we get our independence?
17 something.
We're teachers.
I actually don't teach what's in our curriculum.
First off, David Grush first appeared on News Nation over a month before his sworn testimony in the House. Apparently, even though News Nation looks clunky and seems way too interested in aliens, they are a subsidiary of WGN, a real cable channel. Anyway. Now, while I don't frequent fringe sites much at the moment, I do appreciate social media as a whole, and Wikipedia when it's not being biased, for allowing me to stay mostly up to date. Second, David Fravor and Ryan Graves, and their videos, had been on the JRE 3 years and 1 year, respectively, well before last month's hearing. Last but not least, this idea that not only has the government been collecting crashed alien spacecraft and their pilots, and they have also been trying to reverse engineer them, is not a new idea. Independence Day with Will Smith, Jeff Goldblum, Bill Pullman, and Randy Quaid came out in 1996. That's over a quarter century ago. I had watched the movie in the theater on the day it came out, when I was about 16. Side note, this was the same year that the movie Twister was also released, and I lived in South Dakota at the time. And wouldn't you know it, there was a funnel cloud that had almost turned into a tornado when we left the theater. So I wasn't going to be at the least bit surprised at all if I had walked out of the theater after watching Independence Day and found the planet being invaded by real aliens. While I did not like how the writers or director had made the aliens the bad guy once again, I did, however, enjoy the scenes of Area 51 and the story of how the U.S. military would not work with them because of it, and Brent Spiner's performance. It is, however, very true that humans get along much better when there is an external threat to the whole group.
We're fighting for our right to live, to exist. Today, we celebrate our Independence Day.
That's what made Ronald Reagan's Star Wars speech so compelling. Come on. Before now, all of this had only been in the mainstream media or entertainment in general. Well, other than blogs and message forums, but those had generally been just suppressed. Now it's in the official public record, though. And as Giorgio's tweet or X states, today the planet has learned that officially that the U.S. has known about these non-human intelligences since the 1940s. But I can only assume that any UAP activity prior to the Manhattan Project and whatever the Russians called their nuclear weapons program, which both began in 1942, could, I guess, only be attributed to maybe Nazi Germany. Not only did they have a nuclear weapons program and many other programs, of course, but one of these programs supposedly has them recovering and researching crashed alien spacecraft from recent times and possibly digging up ones from the ancient past. It's a well-known story that I can only assume to be correct. My other assumption is that they only ever recovered crashed vehicles, and that made it hard to reverse engineer them, especially when you don't have one that actually works, or one that doesn't, when you don't have a craft that operates, whichever one. Now, I'm not sure if they're probing into the occult, accumulated into seances with otherworldly beings or not, but it's certainly a fun idea to ponder. Last month's testimony, however, included descriptions of actual UAPs from credible military pilots. Now, these men had to be the best of the best and at the top of their game when they were flying sorties or running practice missions. Now, they mentioned a flying black cube inside a clear sphere, a hovering red square the size of a football field, objects going from cruising speed to Mach 2 in the blink of an eye, from 12,000 feet to 80,000 feet, which is space according to NASA and the military, all within the blink of an eye. The main takeaway from this is that supposedly no nation on this planet can create the materials that could withstand the G-forces that these maneuvers would produce under, well, conventional means. Then again, these crafts do not produce any exhaust or exhibit any relative heat signature. Their means of propulsion is completely hidden from us, other than how they do not seem to create a splash when they enter the water.
It's getting close.
Yeah, we have 31 knots sustained wind, topside, gust of 40.
What was splashed? Splashed. Mark bearing and range.
My theory is that these crafts must be using some sort of field effect transportation, or FET. And I don't believe I made that up. I'm pretty sure I have heard that from somewhere. Basically, you create a force field where everything within that field experiences little to no gravity. Everything stays in place and shouldn't feel much when the craft moves. Outside the force field, particles or space itself is moved around the craft, leaving nothing changed or moved from its original position, and possibly eliminating all resistance. There's more to it than that, but that's the basic idea. Now, research has already proven that electromagnetic fields can achieve similar results, but the technology is so rudimentary and requires so much power that the best we can do is hover a train inches above a track or make a frog float. It's nice that Giorgio brings up, again, the ancient Vimana and Stupa and Ratha stories of the ancient Vedic texts of India. Giorgio's been featured many times on the History Channel in a show called Ancient Aliens, talking about these machines. These machines were described in ancient times exactly how we describe the ones we see today. Yeah, I know, Giorgio has been attached to other silly ideas because of that show. Most producers want as many episodes as possible when a series gains momentum, and sometimes they will stretch premises a bit too far. I mean, they had a Bigfoot episode, for crying out loud. While I do love the idea that maybe we don't see Bigfoot anymore is because aliens took them into space, or maybe they are still here, but using alien technology to stay away from man. But those are silly ideas, better suited for science fiction stories. Not on a cable channel that wants to be taken seriously while simultaneously releasing fake documentaries like Finding Bigfoot and Hunting Hitler. Anyway, like Giorgio correctly claims in his tweet, or X, unless we've all been duped and deceived by a bunch of crazy people, disclosure just happened in today's, July 26th, congressional hearing. Now, there is a chance that at least some of this is disinformation. The common assumption is that at least 15% of all data is faked by the government. Well, that's not including the fake photos, videos, or documents everyday citizens conjure up. I put that at about a third, which together with the government-funded information, or disinformation, makes almost half of all data available. And I've done no studies, but this is my best approximation based on my own personal experience. And it could easily be more than half. Now, this doesn't discount the other testimonies or videos. It does, however, cause pause for concern whether this is possibly a psyop. If it is a psyop, or psychological operation, what kind of psyop is it? Did the U.S. military invent the technology, but they don't want any other nation to know? Is the U.S. military embarrassed that some other country has figured it out and are operating these crafts in and near our airspace? Could this be all part of a slow drip of disclosure meant to be more of a distraction from other news rather than an honest attempt to catch citizens up on what's been going on? I'd imagine that they would be worried about backlash for keeping this a secret for so long and possibly killing people to maintain the secrecy. It's no surprise that they did their best to discredit Bob Lazar. Bob allegedly did see crafts and may or may not have seen a couple aliens. He was brought into the project at Area S4 near Area 51 because of his experience with propulsion after he attached a jet engine to his Honda CRX. He allegedly had his hands on the actual materials from a UAP in the government's attempt to recreate or reverse engineer the technology. Unfortunately, or rather in this case maybe fortunately, science doesn't exist well in a vacuum, and the compartmentalization of the project made the task impossible, or maybe near impossible. For all we know, if Bob's wife hadn't cheated on him, compromising his security clearance, he may have stayed within the program. It's difficult to say whether anyone has figured out the technology, but at the very least, the U.S. government has one or two crafts that still flew by Bob's account. If I'm not mistaken, there was an earlier statement from the military where they admitted to having crafts from another world. Maybe it was only implied that they made the statement because they still needed help figuring out the technology. Bob may now be tinkering away in his own chemistry lab, and he may or may not be in possession of some Element 115. But so far, the frequent government raids on his home and his lab have turned up nothing. Nada. Zilch. Zero. Element 115 supposedly what made the technology function by providing a tremendous amount of power and the ability to create gravity and or gravity waves. The issue with that, though, is how Element 115, as we understand it, is unstable with a half-life of less than a second. It had only been theorized before, but in 2003, over a decade after Bob had originally spilt the beans, Element 115 was finally synthesized within a particle accelerator. Now, it was named Moscovian because this happened in an area that is part of Moscow. So, how does this element that has a half-life just barely longer than the average blink of an eye exist long enough for it to be removed from a UAP and studied? Bob did possibly mention a story of a large explosion that killed a different team who had tried to take a sample of the element. Now, this reminds me of the example used to debate this topic, where we tried to consider what people from a previous era, like the 18th or 19th century, would do if they encountered a nuclear device from today. It's highly likely men would have died from radiation poisoning when they tried to open it up. It's also highly likely that they would have determined it to be too dangerous to study until perhaps another time. Sealing it away, perhaps by burying it, would have been the easiest way to contain the radiation if it didn't already have a meltdown, making the entire area highly contaminated. Now, we all like to think that we have the intelligence and the tools available to figure out almost anything. The people of the past, or at least some of them, thought the same thing too. Now, this goes back to recovering crashed UAPs, or maybe ones that did land too. Both David Grush and Bob Lazar claim that the U.S. government not only recovered ones from recent times, but they also have ones dug up from possibly ancient times. Probably the same ones the Nazis had procured. Maybe. Just a wild guess. This begs the question, did they crash and become buried by natural forces over time, or were they deliberately buried by humans? This also begs the question whether these crashes were accidental, or maybe perhaps intended to help jumpstart the human civilization. Likewise, this brings to mind the Ark of the Covenant. Not only did it allegedly kill those around it, besides those operating it correctly, but it too has vanished, if it was ever real at all. If it is real, I'm most certain it's in a rich person's vault, instead of a Jewish temple in Ethiopia. That is, of course, if it's not under Oak Island, with its cursed labyrinth of traps, keeping it safe for the time being. However it happened, Bob Lazar saw what he saw, and he, along with David Grush, were told what they were told. Could they have been given a false narrative to hide the human origins of this technology? Is killing them somehow too costly for the U.S. government's optics, even though it allegedly hasn't stopped them before? I sure hope nothing like that happens to them, or anyone, but the longer they remain among us, the more it seems like possible disinformation. Then again, that could be exactly what the U.S. government wants you to think. Meanwhile, it is all mostly true. I'm curious what your thoughts may be. Don't allow the government to oppress you into being silent. I implore you, no, I dare you to leave a comment. I also dare you to hit that like button and to double click the subscribe button. If anything happens, please note that I am not contemplating suicide and I don't have an engine that runs on water in my garage. Now, this is MrLiveOcean signing off, hopefully not for the last time.